This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Rabbi said Parshas Vayigash, but today is also a very important date in the Jewish calendar. And not only is it Erev Shabbos, and not only is it the 3 days before the Tainus, but it's also Ches Teves. They say Ches Teves. They didn't tell me about Ches Teves in Yeshiva. What's Ches Teves? So actually, if you look in Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Taf Kuf Pei, originally Ches Teves was a fast day. It says in Shulchan Aruch, B'shmoyne b'Teves, on the 8th day of Teves, Nechtava HaTorah Yuvanis. The Torah was translated into Greek. Bimei Talmai HaMelech, in the days of King Talmai.
Septuagint.
The Septuagint.
So it was finished on...
And it was completed on the 8th day of Teves. And says the Shulchan Aruch, a interesting phenomenon occurred. At that point, V'haya choshech ba'olam shloisha yamim. Darkness descended down to the world for 3 days. That's what it says in Shulchan Aruch.
No wonder it rained this morning.
Yeah. So the darkness descended down to the world for 3 days. So Chassam Sofer says, what is this? The darkness descended down. Why? What was so bad? Actually, historically, the Jews achieved great honor in the eyes of all the nations of the world once the Torah became accessible to the nations of the world. Actually, if you look in Josephus, and if you look in a book, Ma'or Einayim, it says that the day the Torah was translated into Greek, it was Oira v'simcha Yisrael. It was light and happiness, because the Goyim began to appreciate the value of Jewish knowledge. They understood that actually all knowledge is contained in the Torah. Look at number 2. The Chassam Sofer asks, actually this is in Parshas Shemais, in a drasha that he used to give on Ches Teves. You know, in Europe, the Rabbanim used to give drashas not every Shabbos. It's a Amerikanische Zach, the rabbi has to speak every week. In Europe, the rabbi spoke 4 times a year and he got an aliyah every Shabbos. In America, the rabbi has to speak every week and gets an aliyah 4 times a year. But anyway, so the Chassam Sofer says like this: V'havin ma'ashekasa b'Megillas Tainus. To understand what it says in Megillas Tainus, ki b'ches Teves, on the 8th day of Teves, shehutaka Torah Yavanis, that the Torah was translated into Greek, haya choshech ba'olam, there was darkness in the world. Umatam l'choshech hazeh, asked the Chassam Sofer, what's the reason for this darkness? Umatzinu b'sefer Yosifon, we find in Josephus, b'sefer Ma'or Einayim, shehaya oira v'simcha liYehudim. There was great light and happiness for the Jews. V'hisigu al yedei zeh kavod gadol, and we achieved great honor. V'hamelech v'ha'amim hikiru yikar ha'Torah kirabahi, and the king Talmai and the Greek people appreciated the value of the Torah. So what was so tragic in translating the Torah?
Who
70 Chachamim.
Who makes that? Who quotes this?
We know it.
Some Sofer. Some
It
Sofer.
was an aberration, right? I mean, it was...
Well, the Gemara Megillah, we learned, says that they had to change certain things. But what was the tragedy of translating it into Greek? Now we find in this week's Parsha, Parshas Vayigash, that Yosef is trying to identify himself to his brothers, and he says, I'll prove to you I'm Yosef. He says, I'll prove to you I'm Yosef. Why? V'hine einechem ro'os, your eyes see, ve'eni achi Binyamin, and the eyes of my brother Binyamin, ki pi ha'medaber aleichem, that it's my mouth that is speaking to you. So Rashi says, what's the raya? Rashi says, ki pi ha'medaber aleichem, b'lashon ha'kodesh. I'm speaking to you in the holy tongue. That's a raya that I'm Yosef.
Didn't he show them as
So Rashi brings another pshat, the Mila. But Rashi here is explaining what are the words.
That's a good question. Mila, all the extreme Gemara.
That's a good kasha on the part of Rashi that's not on the sheet. But in terms of what Rashi says that's on the sheet, Rashi says the words Ki pi hamedaber is the Lashon HaKodesh. So a good question on what's on the sheet is the Raya Yosef's Yosef because he spoke Lashon HaKodesh. Imagine if you came, I'll bring you a Raya, I'm your brother Fernando because I speak Spanish. So does most of the United States of America. That's because, Mexico is right on the border. the fact that you're speaking Hebrew, the fact you're speaking Lashon Kodesh, is not Haraya or Yosef. I mean, Canaan is the neighboring country. That's the language they spoke in Canaan.
The translator also spoke Hebrew.
Right, the translator also spoke Hebrew. The brothers spoke Hebrew. Half of Egypt, probably on the street signs, they had signs in Egyptian and Hebrew for all the tourists.
Like today.
Right, yeah. So what's the raya that he's Yosef? And the Ramban asks, Ki piha medaber aleichem b'lashon ha'kodesh. What Yosef means to say is the proof that I'm Yosef is because I'm speaking in Lashon HaKodesh. Das HaMefarshim, says Ramban, this is the opinion of the Mefarshim. V'hu Targum Onkelos. This is the way Onkelos translates it, right? If you look at Onkelos on the words, Ki piha medaber aleichem, Yosef is saying, I'm speaking in your language, Hebrew, so that's the proof that I'm Yosef. Says Ramban, what's the proof? What kind of proof is that? They speak in Hebrew. Ramban says, V'yitachen, it's possible, Sha'amar lahem kach, la'amaslo u'lapios. He was just, giving some kind of excuse. There is no proof whatsoever that someone in Egypt speaks Hebrew. The Ramban says, my position is that in Canaan, everyone spoke Lashon HaKodesh. You know how I know that? So maybe you say, no, in Canaan they spoke Canaanese. And Avraham was the only one who spoke Hebrew. Ramban says, no. Because where did Avraham come from? Avraham didn't bring Hebrew over to Israel. Avraham came from Aram Naharaim. What do they speak in Aram Naharaim? Aramaic. What's the proof? The Ramban uses a play on words. V'hagal hazeh aid. The proof is the mound. What do they call the mound? Yagar Sohadusa. So we see they didn't speak Hebrew in Aram Naharaim. They spoke Aramaic in Aram Naharaim. So if Avraham spoke Hebrew, you know where he learned it from? In Canaan, they spoke Hebrew. Skip the brackets.
So maybe when Rashi says it, that you could learn out, maybe, that it wasn't just speaking Hebrew as a language, maybe talking to the Torah. But what he said was clearly what he learned from his father Yaakov, and they would know what he learned from Yaakov. So it's not that he used the language, it's the words that he used that make them understand that he was special.
So let's try to investigate this. The Ramban says, "V'rabim b'Mitzrayim yodim oisay kikarafu." Ramban says there are many people in Mitzrayim that knew the language because it was close. V'yafki hamoishel, and especially the king. I mean, if there were the ordinary citizen in Mitzrayim knew Hebrew, certainly a king like Yosef would know Hebrew. Kings, the high-ranking officials, normally know languages. Like even Nebuchadnezzar in Bavel, when he related his dream, the Ramban says he related in Hebrew. Why? Because his advisors knew Hebrew very well. Okay? So the Ramban says, the fact that Yosef spoke Hebrew is not a raya whatsoever that he's Yosef. So let's talk about the following question in general. The Hebrew language. Now I shouldn't say Hebrew, but the language of the Torah. What does it refer to? What is it called? Lashon HaKodesh. Why is it called Lashon HaKodesh?
Because Christ used the Torah to create the world. And he's inside of it, and not Yahweh, right? Like put himself inside of it. So
the Torah, but maybe the language itself. You wouldn't say English is holy, even though Art Scroll Gemaras are written in English. So how do you know? Why is Hebrew called Lashon HaKodesh?
Because no evil, no dirty words.
There are no dirty words in Lashon HaKodesh. So let's see. This is a question raised by the Ramban in Parshas Kisisa. The Ramban wants to know that Moshe Rabbeinu told Klal Yisrael that the Machzis HaShekel should be Machzis HaShekel B'Shekel HaKodesh. So Ramban said, what makes the Shekel Kodesh? I know, people worship their money, but what exactly is holy about the Shekel? So the Ramban starts off by saying in Parshas Kisisa, Perek Lamed, Pasuk Yud Gimel, that Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who minted the Machzis HaShekel. And he had the authority to be able to do this, because he was a great king. And he called this matbea a shekel. By the way, very interesting. Why are the coins called shekel? Because they had a complete weight. They were not a full weight. They were not missing anything. Says the Ramban, let me tell you why the shekel...
Shekel's a weight.
To weigh. Shekel means to weigh. In other words, it had its full weight in silver. Shekel means... Right? Okay. Says the Ramban, you know why the shekel was holy? Because what do you do with the shekel? You pay out erechin, you pay pidyon haben, you pay pidyon habachar, which are holy activities. You give it, donate it to the Mishkan. Anytime the Torah says to pay money, they use the shekel. That is why the shekel is considered holy. Says the Ramban, look on the fourth line, that is why I feel that Hebrew is called Lashon HaKodesh. The same way the shekel is called Shekel HaKodesh, because you use it for holy endeavors, to pay the Erechin, to pay the Pidyon Chamar, to pay the Pidyon Haben, to give the Knesses in the Torah. V'chein hatam etzli b'masher abasenu koirin Lashon HaTorah Lashon HaKodesh. Look at very carefully. Ramban said, that's why I feel our rabbis call Hebrew Lashon HaKodesh. Look at those words. The rabbis call Hebrew Lashon HaKodesh. Nowhere in Tanakh is Hebrew called Lashon HaKodesh. It's the Tanoim that call it Lashon HaKodesh. We'll see where. Why do they call it Lashon HaKodesh? The Torah, or prophecy. What language did God select to give the Torah and to teach prophecy? Hebrew. That's the language God uses to speak to His prophets. V'mados and to His people. He said Anochi. He said Lo Yiyah. All the other dibros. Those are the Hebrew words are the words that are selected to refer to God. Like Kael, Elohim, Tzavaka, Shaka, Yud-Kei, Vav-Kei. And the 72-letter name of God. Ubai bara ilamai. God used Hebrew to create the world. And God called the heaven and earth in Hebrew names, and He called His malachim in Hebrew names, and He called His holy people Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in Hebrew names. So therefore, since the language is associated with Kedusha, the language has Kedusha. Says the Ramban, but not everybody agrees to this explanation. The Rambam, in the Sefer Mar Nevuchim that Mr. Sherman says, you know why Hebrew is called Lashon HaKodesh? I'll let you look at the Mar Nevuchim, look at number 7. The Rambam writes in the Mar Nevuchim, you know why Hebrew is called Lashon HaKodesh? V'yesh li oitam, I have another reason. B'ma shenikra l'shaynenu zeh Lashon HaKodesh. And why this language is called Hebrew, the holy tongue. Says the Rambam, don't think it's because we're arrogant and we want to call our language the holy tongue, or because we're wrong about it. It's truth. Why? This holy language, there are no words that refer to the reproductive organs. There's no Hebrew word for it. No, there's a Hebrew word for it, but there's no word for it in Lashon HaKodesh. There's no word in Lashon HaKodesh for the male member. There's no word in Lashon HaKodesh for the female organ. There is no word in Lashon HaKodesh for zera, for semen. There's no word for urine. There's no word for excrement. Says the Rambam, what do you call it? You call it zera. Zera means children. No, it's a euphemism. There's no word, we call it hashtana, something that pours forth. There's no word for excrement. You call it saya, something that comes out. Why? Okay, anyway, so the Rambam writes in the Mar Nevuchim, the reason why Lashon HaKodesh is called Lashon HaKodesh is because there are no improper words. So what does the Ramban say about this? The Ramban says this is absolutely incorrect. Why? Because that's not a reason to call it Lashon HaKodesh. That's a reason to call it Lashon Nekiah, a clean language. It's a clean language. It's a decent language. But because you don't have a word for the reproductive organs, that's a reason to call it holy. It's not holy, it's clean. Like the Chachamim always say, ki im halechem asher hu oichel. Right? The only thing Yosef couldn't have control over is the bread that he ate, and referring to the wife of Potiphar.
I have difficulty with this.
Right? That's a Lashon Nekiah. That's a Lashon Nekiah.
Why do we have this whole discussion if the Torah is written in Hebrew, the fact that the Torah is written in Hebrew, is that enough to say that it's Lashon HaKodesh?
So, is English holy because the Artscroll Gemara is written in English?
No, but HaKodesh Baruch Hu gave us the Torah. And if he chose to give us the Torah in Lashon HaKodesh, in and of itself, that should make it...
So that's what the Ramban says. Any holy endeavor God embarks upon, he uses Hebrew.
So that should make it Lashon HaKodesh.
But, no, that's what the Ramban says. And the Chassam Sofer says, the Rambam he doesn't agree with, and the Ramban he doesn't agree with. Why? Because neither reason is giving an inherent Kedusha to Lashon HaKodesh. Think about it. Why do we call a shekel? Why do we call a shekel? 1 second. Does a shekel have Kedusha? Absolutely not. So why is it called shekel HaKodesh? Because any time we need to do something Kadosh, we use the shekel. So some Sofer says, by the same token, then it would come out, Lashon HaKodesh has no Kedusha. Why do we call it Lashon HaKodesh? Because any time we want to do something of holiness, we use this language. But that's not giving a reason for its inherent Kedusha.
If we had a Sefer Torah that was just parchment, or it was parchment, and we took the words in Hebrew, we translated in English, and we inscribed them on the cloth of a Sefer Torah, would that have Kedusha?
Possibly. The Gemara Megillah says
But
possibly.
we know that if it's written in Hebrew, it's Vadai Kedusha.
Okay,
so doesn't that tell you that the Lashon itself is Kedusha? Is Kodesh? I don't know why you need any more proof than that.
By Hashem. No?
But fine. Does that mean? Well, I'll ask you a question. Does that mean stone has Kedusha? Because we wrote the let me ask you a question.
God wrote it.
Yes,
Does cowhide have Kedusha?
I'm not talking about God.
I'm talking about cowhide.
God put the letters on
Stone. So does stone have Kedusha because God put the letters? I said no.
Deborah's would have Kedusha.
Fine, but stone doesn't. The same way stone...
Only because the words that were written on it.
So the same way stone doesn't have Kedusha because God put the words on the stone, the language doesn't have Kedusha just because God happened to use that language for Torah.
It's the words that make it Kodesh.
The locals would not didn't have Kedusha.
They did have Kedusha.
Absolutely.
But why does that mean...
So that's stone.
Correct, but does that mean all stone in the world has Kedusha? No.
Salah made the Mishkan, right? They said one of the things he was able to do is with Cyrus, all he uses different osios and know from the osio. He didn't use the 70 other languages. He only used the Hebrew.
But what's the proof that it has Kedusha? What's the proof? So you were saying...
It's to God. It came from God. That's all I have to say. Yeah.
Well, Japanese also came from God.
We learned last week with Yerushalayim.
I don't think Japanese was handed down in heaven. But Hebrew was. That's what I'm saying.
Rabbi, didn't we learn last week about Yerushalayim and Beis HaMikdash? Yerushalayim is not Ira Kodesh.
Now, I understand why Yerushalayim is Ira Kodesh, but what about the language? Ramban says the language has Kedusha. Why? Because God used those words to name heaven and earth, to name Abraham and Yitzchak. So the Chassam Sofer says it just comes out that the Ramban is saying the same way the shekel is called shekel HaKodesh, because whenever you need to do something Kodesh, you use that shekel. So too, Lashon HaKodesh is called that, because whenever you need to say something holy, you use that. But it says the Chassam Sofer, it comes out of the Ramban, the language has no inherent Kedusha.
Who wrote the Sefer Torah?
Which one?
The original Sefer.
First one.
First one. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, right?
Okay, yeah.
Did he do it by himself? Or was there somebody who was telling him, write down?
Hashem was telling him.
So did he tell him to do in Japanese?
No.
Those letters that we
Fine.
see
So
are letters that were inscribed, told by the Rebbeinu Shalom to his first, agent.
Correct.
To write it down in Hebrew.
Fine. But those words, when they're not in the context of Torah, do they have Kedusha? According to Ramban, no. It's only because, right? The same way the shekel, when you're using it to put into the jackpot slot, has no Kedusha. Its only Kedusha is because of its association with Davar Kadosh. The Ramban is saying, you know why you're calling Lashon HaKodesh Lashon HaKodesh? Because whenever you need to do something of Kedusha, you use that language, which implies it doesn't have inherent Kedusha.
The shekel HaKodesh has Kedusha because you're infused with it.
That's not what the Ramban says. No, that's not what the Ramban says. The Ramban says that it's called shekel HaKodesh because whenever you need to do something of Kedusha, you use this coin. But when you're not using a Kedusha, does the coin have Kedusha?
No.
No.
Because you're not using it for...
So I want to know, if somebody does the language of Lashon HaKodesh have inherent Kedusha when it's not being used for the Torah?
It doesn't.
So Ramban seems to be saying it doesn't.
Because you can use it for Bachar de Kazachen.
So the Chassam Sofer disagrees with that. The Chassam Sofer disagrees. Well, what they speak in Israel today is not Lashon HaKodesh. That's clear, right? So the Chassam Sofer says like this. Look at number 8. Avol nirli liyashev tehinei kol harishonim rashu ha'olam. All the Rishonim, they quake the world. My taima likros halashon kodesh. Why do we call the language kodesh? Ma kedusha nimtza. So what kedusha is there? And the Rambam writes, "V'hamoira kasav shaloi nimtzu ba'shemas avari mishkal." There are no words to refer to reproductive organs. Ramban has a question on that, and the Ramban ultimately says, "V'zal kasav shekol dvarim hamakudashim nemru ba'isel lashon." Anything holy was said in that language. Harei b'nit natar v'chol derei neviim. V'yesh lahashiv. So Chassam Sofer says that's a reason it has inherent kedusha. That's the language that people spoke. If the people spoke Japanese, according to Ramban, the Torah would have been given in Japanese. That's not a reason to give the language inherent kedusha. And says Chassam Sofer, an amazing diak. This is a davar nifla. Look through the entire Tanakh. You will not find anywhere that Hebrew is called Lashon HaKodesh. Why is that? Not until the Mishnah do you find the term Lashon HaKodesh. Take a look on your sheets. In number 9, the Mishnah says in Saita, the truth is it's also in Masechta Brachos. Yeah, be'elu ne'amarim b'Lashon HaKodesh. The following things you have to say in Lashon HaKodesh: Mikra Bikurim, Chalitza, Brachas V'Kolos, Brachas Kahana, Brachas Kohen Gadol, Parshas HaMelech. Fine, but look in Sefer Yeshaya. Vayomer El Yakim V'Shevna V'Yayav El Rav Shakei Daber No El Avadecha. Aramis, please speak in Aramaic. Kishoymim Anachnu. That's what we understand. V'Yal Tidaber Eleinu Yehudis. Don't speak in Hebrew. Doesn't say Lashon HaKodesh. Nowhere in the entire Tanakh is Hebrew called Lashon HaKodesh. Not until the Mishnah.
Lashon Yehudish can be translated the tongue of the Jew.
What was they speaking?
But it could be anything.
No, we don't know.
In Yeshaya, in the times of Yeshaya, what were they speaking in the land of Israel?
Kanait.
Only one language, Hebrew. In times of Yeshaya, in times of the Beis HaMikdash?
Not Aramaic?
No, not in Israel.
Much of Tanakh is written in Aramaic.
Only after the Jews went down to Bavel, and Sefer Daniel is in Aramaic, and part of Ezra is in Aramaic. When they went to Bavel, in Bavel they spoke Aramaic, so the parts of Tanakh that are written in Bavel are written in Aramaic. But in Sefer Yeshaya, he was living in Israel, they definitely spoke Lashon HaKodesh, and yet the Navi doesn't call Lashon HaKodesh. The Navi calls it Yehudis. So Chassam Sofer says an amazing thing. Chassam Sofer says there were certain decrees that occurred in the years Tatnu. You know what Tatnu was?
1856.
856.
Wait.
What's 856?
4 minutes to 9. 4 minutes to 9.
4856. 4856.
4856.
4008.
That's in the 19th century.
No.
4856.
12th century.
Sure, it's in
Crusades. The Crusades.
17 years ago.
19th
The times of the Crusades. Jews lived where at the time?
Crusades?
Germany.
1300.
Yeah.
1100, 1300 is a crusade.
Yeah, that the year 8. Tatnu. 4856. 4856. Says Chassam Sofer, you had Jews living in Germany then. What they speak in Germany? German, Yiddish. Says Chassam Sofer, they're living now. They're living now in.
Polish. It's from Poland.
They lived in Poland also.
When did Yiddish start?
Rabbi said, let's. Thank you. They lived in Ashkenaz. It's now in the 18th century. They're living in Lithuania now. They're living in Hungary. Guess what the Jews are still speaking? They don't know one word of Hungarian, and many Jews don't know one word of Lithuanian, and they don't know one word of Polish. Why? They're still speaking German. How is it possible, says Chassam Sofer, that they didn't pick up on the native tongue of where they're living, and they're still speaking their ancestral tongue, it's just because you don't forget language so quickly. If your parents speak to you in a certain language, the language remains. And yet the Chassam Sofer points out, the Jews go down to Bavel, and in less than 20 years, no one is speaking a word of Hebrew, to the extent that nobody even knows the language anymore. How's that possible? Two people knew Hebrew? Most people did not speak Hebrew.
No. The Chachamim spoke Hebrew.
Right, except for select individuals. Even to the extent that in the times of the Mishnah, right, the Gemara says, they had a question, what does it mean, Yehavcha? We had in the Gemara Megillah. What is it? They didn't know certain Hebrew words. They completely lost the language. How's that possible? Says the Chassam Sofer, we find one other analogy to that. You learn a piece of Gemara, and guess how quickly you forget it? Maybe 5 minutes later. What Willie Mays batted in 1960, and what his on-base percentage, that you remember. But what you learned in the Gemara Makkos, Tezayin Amud Aleph, 3 minutes ago, that you can't remember. Why is that? Why is that?
Says it doesn't hold from us.
Right? Why is that?
Too complicated.
Listen, somebody more brilliant than us had that same problem.
Yeah.
Moshe Rabbeinu, right?
So what's the pshat? What's the pshat? What's the pshat? You can remember, Joe DiMaggio's exactly how many hits he got in a row, and what you learned 2 days ago, it's like, what? Because it says the Chassam Sofer, it's a pasuk. It says about the Torah, Hasoif einecha boy ve'einenu. As soon as you turn away from it, it's gone. It's gone. It's elusive. It is number 11. The Torah is elusive. Why is the Torah elusive? In the beginning. Why is the Torah elusive? The Torah is elusive because your mind is a flesh and blood. It's a piece of basar. And the Torah is a spiritual endeavor. And to maintain the knowledge of the Torah and the Kedusha of the Torah, it's very difficult. As soon as a person turns away to his daily affairs, the Torah is like a bird that just flies away. Says the Chassam Sofer, you know what the proof that Hebrew is Lashon HaKodesh? You know what the proof that the language has Kedusha? The proof is the fact they forgot it immediately when they went to Bavel and started acting not b'Kedusha v'Tahara. As soon as the Jews went to Bavel and they started to assimilate and they started to drop and forget the Torah, they forgot the language. Why? Because the language has Kedusha. Says the Chassam Sofer, you know why Lashon HaKodesh is called Lashon HaKodesh? Not because it has no words for improper words. Not because it's associated with something holy. It inherently has Kedusha. And the proof's in the pudding. The proof is when we went down to Bavel, we forgot it immediately. So let's take a look at this inside. Look at number 11.
About the Jews in Egypt.
Yeah.
They didn't forget it.
Well, let's see. We'll come back to that. Liyashev, nearly lahaktim. Mashakasav Chazal. Chazal tells him brachos. Uvnei reshef yagbiu of. Einu fela Torah shenemar hasoif einecha boy ve'enenu. About the Torah, if you ignore it for a moment, it's gone. Harei heyid al ha-Torah. The Gemara is testifying about the Torah. Deshchicha shikcha gaba yoser mikol chachmos ha'amuka sheba'olam. You could have the most complicated math problem. You could have the most complicated and subtle piece of information. You will retain it more than you retain Torah. Torah is the hardest thing to retain. The Gemara says in Megillah, Lo'ukma girsa, in order to get to the right conclusion in Torah, siyatahu mishmaya, the only way to do it is if you have heavenly assistance. Why? Perish l'kayim mishnasai shalei tishkach. In order to remember your learning, lo yoyal hishtalis v'yagia. All your hishtalis. You could take fish oil from today till tomorrow. You could take omega-3 to improve your brain cells. You won't remember anything of learning without heavenly assistance. Why? The Hanisayan Meidlanu experience testifies. The reason is ki kol dvarim hakadoshim shem ruchniim, any matter of holiness, of spirituality, einam chonim bertsonam eitzel hagashmiim, is not maintained in something physical. Sheken Chazal Amru, V'atashus alai kapecha. The neshama, says the Chassam Sofer, brings down from the Gemara, the neshama wants to jump out every moment, and if not for the fact that God is holding his hand down on the neshama, stay, the neshama would say, get me out of here. Because Torah is elusive. Skip a couple lines down. V'ata nechsa, the first word online is aval. V'ata nechsa anan. Let's take a look. Notzis libenu. Hine achinu anshe Polonia. Our brothers in Poland. Hema darim b'medina asher kol amma medam sas Poland. All the Jews in Poland, right? Chassam Sofer was talking in the beginning of the 19th century. They're living in a country, everyone's speaking Polish. V'Litveya, v'Russia, v'einem akim kab loshen Ashkenazi. Nobody in Poland and Lithuania knows German. V'ahudim kulam lios golei Ashkenaz. These Jews who stammed from Ashkenaz, shelafnim gzeres tanu oidim medam loshen amam Ashkenaz. Since the last 800 years, they're still speaking their Yiddish. They're still not speaking the language of their country of residence. The people from Spain, they're still speaking their Ladino. They were exiled with their parents, so they're raised on the same language for generations. Isn't it
because the Holy Scriptures were translated into Yiddish or into Ladino?
Yeah, but
some of the yeshivas today still have, when you learn the mother,
they still teach in Yiddish. But how could it be for 800 years they're still speaking German? Not just what they're learning in their everyday conversations. And Chassam Sofer says Jews didn't even know Russian, Polish. Yeah, in the 20th century they knew Polish.
Like Irving said, they were living in a ghetto.
No.
And they were learning Yiddish
in Hungary they weren't living in the ghetto. In Russia they weren't living in the ghetto. In
Hungary they didn't speak Yiddish in Hungary.
Yeah, but he's saying, the Chassam Sofer is saying the Jews that came from Ashkenaz, they're still speaking that. He says, V'zeh ha'yu kvar kama me'er shanim.
So why didn't
V'im kein yesh l'tmaya kivan shivnei bayis rishayim adam Yehudis. Says the Chassam Sofer, if the Jews spoke Hebrew in the times of the first Beis HaMikdash, kimavur b'divrei El Yakim, asher ala bayis hanal. So eich b'mei golas bavel chish kal nishtan adam b'mei tchilas bayis sheni kfar ir bevu l'shonim. How is it possible in a mere 70 years the language was completely forgotten? Ve'afal pi shaya b'hem nesuei nashim nachuyos. Yeah, they intermarried. Fine. But that's the reason to forget the language? Umisham kain chatzim midaber ashtodis mikamakim in safik sharub mahay b'nei Yisrael v'gam oisim b'nei nachuyos hay roi sheishtan loshna kosh v'roisim rovim v'dam loshna hu v'hu achas mehatmiois hagedoylois shebe'oilam. Says Chassam Sofer, this is one of the most perplexing thing in the history of mankind. That the Jewish people, listen, they return to the Holy Land, they return to Israel, and they're not speaking Hebrew. Times of Bayis Sheni, the Jews come back, they spoke not a word of Hebrew. Says the Chassam Sofer, this is one of the most astonishing things in the history of the world. You know why? Because the language has Kedusha, and Kedusha is elusive. And when the Jews begin to mingle and don't act the Kedusha, the language goes lost the same way you forget your Gemara Makis, you forget Lashon HaKodesh. That's the only explanation the Chassam Sofer could give for what he calls one of the most perplexing things in the history of mankind.
So why do people speak Hebrew today and they are secular?
It's not Lashon HaKodesh.
Not Lashon HaKodesh.
So Rabbi says the Chassam Sofer.
And all the yeshivas that existed all during this time, they didn't speak Hebrew at all. I mean, maybe they translated into they learned the Gemara, they learned Chumash, they learned that.
But they didn't speak the language. In terms of any of their dealings, they came back to Eretz Yisrael. The Goyim in Eretz Yisrael are speaking Lashon HaKodesh. And the Jews are not. The Jews are not. Says the Chassam Sofer, there's no question that it's because the language has Kedusha. Says the Chassam Sofer in Parshas Vayigash, an amazing thing. Ki pi ha-medaber aleim. Perish Rashi. Look at number 12. Ki pi ha-medaber b'Lashon HaKodesh. Nira. Ki segulas Lashon HaKodesh. It is the mystical quality of Lashon HaKodesh. Shelo yiskayim ba'adam she'enim meshamar atzim b'kedusha. If the person does not keep himself the Kedusha, if the person doesn't act the Kedusha, the language is gone. Shepele Gadol, who? Some say this, a great wonder. Begalis Bavel, Bizman Shivim Shana, Nishtakach Lashon HaKodesh. The Jews come back to Israel, they're speaking Chaldean and Ashdodis. Why? Because they didn't act the Kedusha, they lost the language. And therefore Yosef says to his brothers, I'll prove to you I'm Yosef. You know what the proof is? Because if I was someone other than Yosef, he wasn't just proving he's Yosef. I'm Yosef, your brother. I'm the same Yosef that you remember from Yaakov's house that I spent all day. Ki ben zekunim. What does the Baal Turim say? Zraim, Kadshim, Nashim, Yeshuais, Mayed, learning, Shas. I am that same Yosef. And the raya is, because if I did not act the Kedusha v'Tahara, I would have been like the Jews in Bavel who completely forgot Lashon HaKodesh. Now, some Sofer says...
the Egyptians were speaking Hebrew, they weren't speaking Lashon HaKodesh? We said the proof was before... You can't just say that it's because he spoke Hebrew, because many people spoke Hebrew. They were also speaking Lashon HaKodesh.
So the point is that the Egyptians, they knew Hebrew. They knew Hebrew. Yosef is saying, Lashon HaKodesh is still my native tongue. It's still my language. The fact that that's how I talk, the fact that's my means of conversation, that's my mode of conversation, that demonstrates that I had to be acting Kedusha. Chassam Sofer says two added things, then we'll end. Number one, the language has inherent Kedusha. Number two, the Chassam Sofer brings down, we're not going to have time to read it inside, it's really voluminous material here. But Chassam Sofer says there's a pasuk that says, El Ginas Egois Yaradati, Ginas is Rashi Teves, Gematrios, Notrikin, Temura, which means that in the Hebrew language, when psukim are written in Hebrew, it's not just in the beginning God created the world, right, heaven and earth. Every Hebrew letter has a numerical value, has Rashi Tevos that it stands for. If you could switch an aleph for a taf and a beis for a shin. And all of these means and layers of meaning are lost when you translate into a different language. Because when it's translated into Greek, all you have is a simple meaning, but you lose all the layers of meaning. And then the Chassam Sofer adds an amazing thing. And the Chassam Sofer says that the truth is that this is in number 14. How is a person supposed to learn Torah unless he's already familiar with all of the wisdom of the world? How could you know, how could you proclaim the new month if you don't know the lunar cycle? How could you know anything about the Shiras Halavim if you don't know music? So Chassam Sofer says, where did the Chachamim get it from? It's all included in the Torah. If you have access to uncoding the secrets of the Torah through the Osios, through the Trup, through the Tilei Tilim, through the Kutzo Shel Yud, the Chassam Sofer says, it is sure that on the words HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Hadashim, the entire astronomy and lunar cycle is alluded to. The Chassam Sofer brings down from Shri Ragain that if you understand the pasuk of V'zeh Toldei Sa'adam, you'll know the art of reading the lines on a person's hand and forehead. All wisdom is included in the Torah. But once the Torah was translated into Greek, how are you going to understand any of these things? You know what you're going to have to do now? You're going to have to open up the secular books of wisdom. The Torah, the Chachmei Yisrael are now going to have to come onto someone else's table. The books of the Goyim. Otherwise they have not going to understand the Torah fully. Says the Chassam Sofer, what does the Gemara tell us about someone who has to eat on someone else's table and can't eat on his own table? Ha'olam choshech ba'adai. The world is dark for him. Says the Chassam Sofer, that's what it means. That on Ches Teves, when the Torah was translated into Greek, darkness descended down to the world for 3 days. Because now we no longer had the access to all of the Chachma that's hidden in the original language of the Torah. That's what Yosef is telling his brothers. He's saying, I'll prove to you that I'm Yosef. Ki pi ha'medaber aleichem, I'm speaking in Lashon HaKodesh. This is a language. Says of something, not like the Rambam says there's no dirty word, not like the Ramban says because it's associated with Kedusha. The language has inherent Kedusha. And that is the darkness that befell the world when the Torah was translated today on Ches Teves Rabosai Agun Shabbos.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.